Welcome everyone to Asialink's webinar, The First 100 Days, Donald Trump and Geopolitical Disruption in Asia. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we are all dialing in from and recognize their continuing connection to land, water, and community. For me, that is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I am delighted to introduce our distinguished panel this evening. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Pham Quang Vinh, the former Vietnamese Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and the former Vietnamese Ambassador to the United States. Please also join me in welcoming Mr. Keith Richburg, a Bangkok-based journalist who spent 3 decades with the Washington Post as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and foreign editor. He is a member of the Washington Post's editorial board for a discussion on the emerging impact of Trump 2.0 in the region. Today's panel will be moderated by Ambassador John McCarthy, former ambassador to the US, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, Japan, and the former Australian High Commissioner to India. I will now pass over to John to begin the conversation. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Leah, and I'd like to thank the panel for joining me this afternoon, and also welcome the visitors to this program. Obviously, we're all still absorbing the impact of the Trump administration in Washington. There have been repercussions around the world. There have been there has been a process of absorption of what is happening globally, certainly to a degree much greater than the first Trump administration. And certainly in terms of change in the United States, I think greater than anything that I can think of as a student of the United States over the last 40 years, including 3 assignments in Washington. Today, what I'd like to do is ask the 3 speakers to talk for about 10 minutes each on their reactions to the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. Their capacity, and first of all, to give their own reactions, but also to assess what is happening as a result of this Trump administration, particularly in their own countries, but also more widely. In the first instance, I'd like to ask Keith to talk about the impact of the Trump administration as an American, seeing what is happening from, even though he's in Bangkok at the moment, seeing what is happening from the perspective of the United States. Secondly, I'd like Ambassador Vinh to talk about the impact, particularly on Vietnam, but also Southeast Asia as a whole. And thirdly, Mari Pangestu will talk about the impact, particularly from an economic perspective, on Southeast Asia, and of course, as a very prominent former Indonesian minister. So without more, I'd just like to mention a couple of points about Australia. We have quite obviously watched the Trump administration with the same interest as any other part of the world. I think it's been particularly, the interest has been particularly pronounced because we have had our own election, which took place on Saturday. There have been mixed views as to whether the Trump phenomenon had an impact on the election in which the Australian Labor government was returned, whether the fact that the Conservatives were to the right of the political spectrum, whether this actually had an impact on the reaction of voters. I think the answer is yes, to some degree, but the significant factors really in this Australian election were domestic. There were cost of living issues, housing issues, issues to do with medical care, which I think probably loomed larger. But the fact that this was a party which was seen as to the right of the political spectrum meant that there was a certain amount of association on the part of that party, or perceived association on the part of that party with the new Trump administration, and that might have counted against it. In fact, to some degree, I think did count against it. The other issues, of course, which Australia has focused on tended to be, as is often the case, very domestic, very internal. There was a concern about the reaction of the Trump administration to the provision of a new set of submarines, a very, very big project in Australia. But also, I think more widely, what the Trump administration would do about China. This, of course, didn't loom particularly large in the election in Australia, but it certainly was on the minds of a number of people in the policy establishment. And of course, although we're getting indications of the way the Trump administration is thinking about Ukraine and is thinking about Gaza, we have not had clear indications about the approach that the Trump administration will take towards China, other than, of course, on the economic front, where the tariffs have had quite a major impact. That's enough from me, I think. So I'd like to hand over now to Keith to give his American perspective. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John, and I'll say good afternoon because I'm in Bangkok where it's afternoon. And nice to meet you, Ambassador Vinh, and Dr. Pangestu. Good to see you here as well. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about just in try to wrap up. And the 100 days in 10 minutes is going to be tricky because this has been a whirlwind 100 days. But I'll be focusing primarily on the impact on Asia. But let me just start for a minute or two by looking back at the Biden administration's approach to Asia. So then we can do kind of a comparison there. And I would say that the Biden administration in their 4 years actually did more to realize President Obama and Hillary Clinton's announced pivot to Asia. You all remember the pivot to Asia that was supposed to happen in the second Obama administration, but they got sucked back into the Middle East and other crises going on. But if you look at what former President Biden did, he invested a lot of time in Asia. He built new security alliances with Vietnam, with the Philippines. He got together a summit meeting for the first time, I believe, with Japan, Korea, and the United States. I believe they did it at Camp David or somewhere in the States. He invested a lot of time in the Quad, which was India, Japan, United States, Australia. He invested a lot of time in this, in the AUKUS, the submarine deal. And so he put a lot of time into this. And so he stepped down, Kamala Harris took over. And I think in Asia, there was a little bit of excitement, especially in ASEAN, because believe it or not, Southeast Asia was the region that Kamala Harris had visited most as vice president. Now, partly that's because Biden was constantly tied down with budget battles and things in Washington. So what do you do when there's an ASEAN meeting? You send the vice president. So she had actually made multiple trips to the region. So she was actually quite invested in it. And so Biden was very interested in actually putting some meat on the bones of this pivot to Asia. And you might say trying to contain China's rise, or you might say trying to at least counter China's aggressive or assertiveness in the region. That was what this was all about: the security pact with Philippines, security pact with Vietnam, et cetera, building the Quad, AUKUS, et cetera, et cetera. The failing of the Biden administration, I would argue, was that there was no economic component to this Asia policy or this Asia pivot. He didn't revive the Trans-Pacific Partnership that was out there. He had this thing called RCEP, which is kind of not a trade pact, but it was kind of a regional economic, forum that didn't really have an open trade component to it, because he actually left a lot of the Trump tariffs in place. Fast forward now, Trump comes in January of this year, and obviously the tariffs were the big thing that hit Asia like a shock. And and Asia is all the countries in Asia, pretty much all of the countries of ASEAN, and you put in Japan, Korea, they are heavily trade dependent. And so these tariffs came as a shock. And don't forget the first round. Now he's climbed down after the first round, but the first round of tariffs that came in with so-called Liberation Day on April 2nd it hit Asia particularly hard. I think Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, which were, were hit particularly with some of the highest tariffs, so 40%, 50% in some cases. I think only tiny Lesotho in Africa got a higher, a higher tariff, the initial rate. Now, as I mentioned, there was a climb down, but don't forget, every country, and people say, oh, he rolled back the tariffs. Well, he didn't really roll them back. He rolled it back to 10% blanket tariff on most countries, which for a lot is still going to have a huge impact. While what's happened is the initial round of tariffs has turned into a US-China trade war, so to speak. I mean, we've got 145% tariff on China. They've got 125% tariff on the United States. That means basically trade is frozen. I mean, nobody's going to put anything on a crate and send it to the United States and pay 145% tariff. So there is no trade now. And I think Xi Jinping, the president of China, president and secretary general of the party, and President Trump are engaged in this kind of weird game of chicken, where they know this can't go on, but neither one wants to be the first one to pick up the phone and say, "Hey, let's sort this out." You see them doing minor climb downs here and there. Suddenly, Trump backed down to say, "Well, okay, Apple iPhones and computers can come in without the tariffs." The Chinese lifted it on a couple of things as well, but they're still both locked in place with nobody really wanting to negotiate this thing. The second major issue of this, I would say, is the Trump administration and the defense secretary, Pete Hegseth, they've talked about wanting to downgrade relations with Europe. They're doing it in a bit of a nasty way by name calling and this sort of thing. But they say the whole reason behind that is they want to be able to focus more on China. They see China as the main threat. But we haven't really seen any indication of that yet. In fact, I think one of the main aircraft carriers, if I'm not mistaken, was redeployed from the Pacific over to the Middle East. So even though they say, oh, this downgrading of NATO, downgrading of relations, making the Europeans pay more, that's also we can get more focus and more energy and more military focus on China. And I haven't seen really any of that happening yet, where forces being redeployed, et cetera, et cetera. What they haven't done so far, and I've not seen this yet, is talk about Japan and Korea having to pay more for the U.S. troops there because they've been so focused on Ukraine, so focused on Middle East, et cetera. I think they haven't quite gotten there yet. And speaking of Ukraine, now this is outside of Asia, what we're talking about, but I will make this point. I think the shift away from, the apparent shift away from Ukraine after, this very strong support from the Biden administration, I think that reverberated through Asia in ways that we still have yet to see. If you've got a defense alliance with the United States, like Vietnam, like the Philippines, if you've got security cooperation with the United States, maybe not a formal alliance like a Singapore, or if you're Taiwan, you're going to be looking at this and asking the question, is the United States a steadfast partner? Can we rely on the United States? Don't forget, Biden got into a little bit of trouble back in 2022 when he mentioned that we will come to the defense of Taiwan. And his aides tried to walk that back a little bit, saying, well, he didn't really change policy, et cetera. And Biden said, no, I meant we will come to the defense of Taiwan if China attacks. Now, he didn't say what that meant. He didn't say necessarily U.S. troops, et cetera, but he made it pretty clear that the U.S. would take any Chinese action against Taiwan seriously, and that would provoke a U.S. reaction. But if you're in Taiwan now and you see how this administration is basically trying to tell Ukraine, hey, you better make a deal. Or if you watch that Oval Office meeting between Zelensky and Trump, where it was turned into a shouting match, and he said, you should be grateful. If you're in Taiwan, you're going to have to ask the question. If you're Japan, you have to ask the question. If you're Korea, South Korea, you have to ask the question, is the U.S. still going to be a reliable partner that will come there in case of any hostilities against us? And one last thing I want to focus on is just at the same time that the Trump administration says they want to pivot to Asia, so to speak, to use the Obama term, they've cut off, I think, some key elements of American power in the region, and that's soft power. And I made a little list here for myself, excuse me for looking down. Number one, they're trying to eliminate USAID, which is the Foreign Aid Funding Agency, the U.S. Agency for International Development. They basically defunded most of it, and they're trying to kind of eliminate it, put it under the State Department. When the earthquake happened recently in Myanmar that we felt here in Thailand, USAID aid workers on the ground there were told, hey, you lost your job. There's no money coming in to help Myanmar. USAID money, there's a lot going into Cambodia. A lot goes into Vietnam. It does things like helping look for landmines in Cambodia left over from the Vietnam War. There are USAID projects in China helping the Chinese bolster their anti-human trafficking programs, helping the Chinese bolster their anti-wildlife trafficking programs. The other thing that was eliminated was U.S. funding for the National Endowment for Democracy, which some of the authoritarian regimes in the region hated, but it does things like it supports free labor unions in the region. It supports independent media in the region. They've defunded, or they have defunded and are trying to defund, and it's being challenged in court, Radio Free Asia. Radio Free Asia was the only outlet that a lot of people had for independent news in places like Myanmar, in Tibet. The Radio Free Asia language services in Tibetan, in Uyghur, in Burmese have all stopped broadcasting now. And that's just a boon to people who want to suppress independent media. And just one other thing that I'm looking at that I'm curious about is this kind of attack on, number one, the attack on universities in America by the Trump administration, and also this attack against foreign students because of their whatever they may have posted on social media or their activism or what. One of the biggest soft power draws of the United States has been our universities. We get people from all over the world, and particularly from Asia. If that starts dwindling or even reducing itself because people see that the U.S. universities are under attack, and more importantly, foreign students may not get their visas approved. They may, they may have to go through a rigorous vetting process. Someone may be looking at their Facebook pages to see if they once supported Gaza. That could be a real turnoff for young people wanting to come to the United States. And that's been a real source of America's soft power, because many of these young people stay in the United States and work. More importantly, they go back to their home countries, whether it's Vietnam. There's a program with Harvard where they bring over Vietnamese students. They go back to Southeast Asia, they go back to China, and they've spent years in the United States. And that's a kind of a, really, to me, a soft power wedge that the United States has that this administration is slowly whittling away at. I won't say it's destroyed yet, but that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye out for. So John, with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Keith. I've just heard from Murray Pangestu, who has come in but has limited time online. So I wonder if I might ask you, Ambassador Vinh, if we could delay you for about 15 minutes, and if you could come in after Murray.
Sure.
Just introducing Murray Pangestu as a very well-known figure in Indonesia's economic world. She has been a minister in former government and is currently a special representative for Indonesia, particularly on trade issues, of course, which puts her right in the middle of the current issue of tariffs being imposed on the countries of Southeast Asia. And of course, the tariffs imposed on Indonesia are of a very significant level. So I'd like to hear Murray's views on what the overall impact of these tariffs are on Southeast Asia, but particularly obviously with reference to Indonesia. So if I could hand over to you, Murray, thank you very much indeed.
Yes, thank you, John, and apologies. I was called into a meeting suddenly, so I'll share my views very briefly, and then I'm gonna have to leave, unfortunately. But I mean, given today's situation, let me just share with you what I call the three-pronged strategy of Indonesia and ASEAN. And as you know, we don't have to go into much detail why and the how this happened, but and the formula that nobody can understand. How come even the island with the penguins also got hit by tariffs? But
part of Australia, by the way.
Yeah, all 10 countries, all 10 ASEAN countries were hit by the reciprocal tariff. Even Myanmar, even after what they went through, they still got hit by something like a 42, I think it was 42%. Cambodia 49, and Vietnam 36. Indonesia got 32%. I think to everybody's shock, what Trump 2.0 did in the tariff. We knew he was going to use tariffs, but we thought it was going to be confined to China or to some of the ones with the big deficits. But the fact that he did such a big shock and at such a scale, I think was a big shock to everyone, to the system, and obviously to the U.S. stock market and so on. But just focusing on how Indonesia and ASEAN have tried to respond and anticipate moving forward, we have I would say a three-pronged strategy. The first strategy is, of course, we have to deal and face how we can deal with these tariffs that are hitting us. And all the analysis actually shows that the impact on ASEAN will be has a differential impact depending on how much you depend on trade, so your trade to GDP ratio, and how much you are dependent on the US market. So with that measure, it's actually Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand to some extent, and Malaysia to some extent, which are the hardest hit countries. Indonesia is least, not so much affected because we only export 9% of our exports to the US, and our trade to GDP is like 22% compared to Vietnam, which is like at 80% of trade to GDP, and their dependency is like 30-40%. But for Indonesia, certain sectors like garments, footwear, furniture, and prawns, because they have a high dependency on the US market, they will be hard hit if there was a tariff. And they happen to be the labor-intensive sectors. So even though if you look at GDP and the impact on exports, it's not big, but on certain sectors and on jobs, it's going to be a big hit. So that's why it's still very important for Indonesia to figure out how they can deal with the US to get the tariffs down. So what Indonesia and ASEAN countries have agreed is that we are not going to retaliate. This was in an ASEAN economic minister statement on the 10th of April, that we won't, it doesn't say we won't retaliate, but we will engage constructively with the US and, find a solution or win-win outcome out of all this. So both Vietnam and Indonesia have actually been having talks with the US. And really what they want, what's in the deal for the US is they want, they basically, it's all in the USTR report, which is basically about, reducing tariffs. In the case of ASEAN countries, actually, our tariffs are not that high. Like take a country like India, that's where they really want tariffs to come down, for instance. But for us, maybe it's more the non-tariff barriers, as well as issues faced by US companies, and what they call economic security, which is about certain sectors like semiconductors, critical minerals. These are some of the sectors that they want to see, not a concentration of China, let's say. And they also want to make sure, because under Trump 1.0, what happened was a lot of relocation happened. A lot of it was to Vietnam as well as Mexico, where basically it was resourcing not from China, but from Vietnam and through Mexico. They call that transshipment, even though some of it does involve value added, not just repackaging. But nevertheless, they don't want to see this happen again in this time round. So they will look at those issues very carefully. So that's kind of what's happening in the negotiations, which are still ongoing, and we don't quite know how they're going to negotiate with so many countries in the 90-day pause. But nevertheless, Indonesia is doing talks with the US. The other two prongs, which I think are important, because it's kind of like we have to live in this world where the geopolitics is just beyond us. It is a world that we no longer has a rules, no longer anchored by the US on the multilateral trading system and the rules-based order. So, but we don't want to be brought. We don't want it to be leading us to leaving what we think has worked for us for the last 3-4 decades to growth, exports, jobs, and development. So for the rest of us, it does mean we have to have another two-pronged strategy. The second prong is that, okay, we will probably end up, I don't think we can collectively approach the US. It's gonna be hard, but collectively we can agree that we will continue to adhere to WTO rules-based trading system, and we will continue to engage between us to improve, strengthen, broaden regional integration between us. And that's ASEAN, it's the RCEP, which includes Australia, New Zealand, China, Korea, and Japan. And in fact, I think right after the tariffs were announced, Japan, Korea, and China did make an appeal that we should do something in RCEP, and then also basically increase your engagement with other trading partners, whether it's within your region and practice open regionalism, and with new partners like the EU, Middle East, and so on. So that's kind of the second prong of the strategy. We continue to open up with each other. We continue to trade and invest with each other. And if we can make RCEP work, we can also have a more diversified supply chain that hopefully meets the rule of origin of the US they can't really have zero China component, but they would want some minimum China component in the value chain, right? So the more diversified you are, the better you're going to be. And then the last prong, which is more an Indonesian strategy, but I think other countries, I think Singapore and others have also made the similar announcement. Okay, this is going to be a very uncertain world. Oh, I'm sorry. In the second prong, we have to make sure that we balance our relationship with China, because this is going to be always important for us. We don't want to be asked to choose. We have to also balance our relationship with China, and we have to manage our relationship with China. There will be a flood of goods coming out of China with trade diversification, and the fact that they can't send their goods to the US, then it will come to our part of the world. So we also need to have a dialogue with China as to how to manage that part of the relationship. The last prong is, given all these uncertainties, we have to increase our domestic resilience. And we have to anticipate if there's going to be a slowdown, if there's going to be a recession, what do we do? What's the macro policy and so on? But I think the main silver lining out of the cloud of the uncertainty of geopolitics and so on is a reaffirmation of the importance of deregulation and structural reforms to increase our own efficiency and competitiveness, and make sure that we can continue to develop, grow, and create jobs. So that's been we've been working a lot on that for the last 2 months, I guess, and the president has has been very firm on yes, we need to do this. We need to have a deregulation package, reform package that will eliminate the high cost economy. There's different parts to it, and parts of it will hopefully be implemented in the very soon, and his credibility will actually go up if he can really deliver on some of these issues that are whatever the US is in the USTR report is actually also issues faced by our own business sector. So let me end there. It's still a lot of devil in the details, as well as the things can be very dynamic. We don't know what will come next, but especially with the US policy. But we do our best to anticipate as well as respond. And I think it will continue. The three-pronged strategy hopefully will continue, because the ASEAN leaders are meeting in about 2 weeks' time, including with China as well, in the upcoming first ASEAN summit. And I believe there will be strong messages coming out of there as well about strengthening regional, while you have to deal with the bilateral and balancing with China, you also want to strengthen the regional as really what should be the answer. Okay, I'm sorry, John, I will have to leave, but I enjoyed listening to Keith and you at the beginning, but I really have to go now because I've been called to another meeting. Thank you so much.
And thank you for your time. Very much appreciated. Thank you. Okay, thanks. Well, perhaps we might go straight to Ambassador Vinh now to hear his views, some of which, will no doubt dovetail a little bit with what Mari was saying. So over to you. Thanks very much indeed, Vinh.
Thank you very much, John. And actually, it has been very helpful to have two previous statements, one on the overall policy of the US and one on Indonesia's case as from ASEAN as well. So a lot of similarities that we can observe. What I want to add now is that with number one, Trump 2.0 is very much different, very much different from his 1.0. The US seems to be redefining many things, including the US interests and its global leadership, and also its approach to allies, to partners, to multilateralism and multilateral norms, to relationship with major powers, as well as to global issues and regional crises. So we see a lot of changes. And we in this region of the world are watching closely as things are still evolving. But we can observe some notable things. For example, the cutoff of the foreign aid or the use of tariff. And we are wondering how the US will be doing if it focuses on this region of the world in Asia and focus on China, how it will be doing with China itself, with allies and partners, and with ASEAN. Still unclear and a lot of uncertainty. And certainly, we need to wait a little bit to see a clearer picture of a strategy by the Trump administration regarding this region, including Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia, especially also a clearer strategy with regard to China. Now, on the question of tariffs, I have many things in common with comments made by our colleague from Indonesia. Trump's reciprocal tariffs have been sending shock waves across the world and here in the region. The 90 days pause may give some time for the countries in the region or the world to talk with the US. But it is really still uncertain how we can see the way we get a deal with the US and what will be the possible outcome. That will still be very much tough. And for the majority of countries in Southeast Asia, we are exporters. So we have been hit the hardest. The figure is that 6 out of 10 countries in Southeast Asia has been revived at the tariff level between 32% to 49%, and Vietnam is 46%. With regard to if you compare with the EU, for example, the tariff level is about 20%. So it's very much higher. And that relates to us not only the economic terms, but also political and diplomatic ties between the region and the US as well, because economic imperatives also for us to make realignments, not only in trade or trade relations or supply chains, but also we are very much dependent on the two big powers, China and the US, economically as well as in security terms. I do agree with the observations made by our colleague from Indonesia regarding ASEAN. ASEAN has met and has responded in a way that that is also in line with many of the countries in ASEAN as well. But generally, it is not to retaliate. It is to highlight and uphold the international trade norms and rules but at the same time, it's very much preferred to get engaged with the US. But engagement with the US under the policies of ASEAN is a dual track. One is that collectively as ASEAN, we will be engaging with the US. But I think that we will be talking more on the principles of our relationship and on the principles of our trade norms and rules. But ASEAN also led countries, individual countries in ASEAN, to pursue bilateral talks with the US. That is where we'll have to come down to negotiations on how we can ask and ensure that the US will lower down its tariffs, its pronounced tariffs on each individual countries. But everything is still unclear yet. For Vietnam, responding to the challenges is a priority job for us right now. And we have been doing it, responding to the challenge, new challenges proactively and in a broader context. And our strategy is something very similar to the Indonesian case. We are doing bilaterally with the US. We are supporting diversification and regional integration. And we are also supporting, upgrading our domestic resilience. As for us, Vietnam, on the overall, we want to have good relations with all major powers, certainly including the US and China. And we've been engaging with the Trump administration since very beginning. We have phone calls, we have a message of congratulations. And unluckily, this year marks the 30th anniversary of our diplomatic relations with the US. So we try to make big things here, but the tariffs are still there. On tariffs, certainly it is a very big challenge for Vietnam as we have been exporting to the US. The proportion of Vietnam's export to the US is about 29 or 30% of our total export. So it is very much an issue here. And since very beginning, even before the tariff that they call the Liberation Day announced by Trump, we have been engaging with the US. And very recently, I think yesterday, the Prime Minister of Vietnam reported to the Parliament a number of measures that have been considered. And these measures include review and reduce tariffs and non-tariff barriers, ensure transparency and rule of origin. That is something related to transshipment. And to buy more American products, to facilitate foreign and American investment here in Vietnam, to uphold global trade rules and norms. By this one, I think we are doing in favor of the US, but at the same time, we have to look around to balance our relations with other countries as well. So not too much differentiate the advantages with one or the other. And we also want to increase relations with other partners. This is political and economic relations as well. But very much important is that we have to restructure and upgrade both our supply chains and our own economy. This is what Vietnam has been doing. We have been watching very closely also the talks between the US and other partners like Japan, Korea, India, or other countries in ASEAN like Indonesia or Malaysia. We know that not only the questions that have been raised in the reports by the USTR, but there are a lot of other questions also, including questions related to tariffs, related to non-tariff barriers, related to policies, related to relationship with other countries as well, especially when the US is targeting some other countries, including Russia or China, for example. So it is very much complicating, and all we have to do is that we need to get into dialogue, but we are still unclear how the trade talks will be conducted because, like our Indonesian colleague has mentioned, the U.S. is doing all together and at the same time with so many partners, and we do not have. They will be able to manage all this one, and no one, even some progress has been reported on the talks between the U.S. and India, between the U.S. and Japan, between the U.S. and South Korea, but everybody seems to be very much cautious on the way forward and on how the final outcome will be. So this is a time of uncertainty, and it is a time of changes and a time of challenge. But for Vietnam, we think we have to continue our way of consistent and consistent engagement with the U.S. in order to reduce the tariffs and to ensure that we can arrive at a solution which is mutually beneficial, not only to Vietnam, but to the U.S. But at the same time, we have to enhance also our relationship with other countries, especially the major trade partners and with ASEAN. It is very much important at this time of the year. And the third pillar is to upgrade our economy, restructure our supply chain so that we can cope with. But the job is not easy. It cannot be done over 90 days that we can change everything with the structure of our import-export, with structure of our supply chain, and certainly with the structure of our economy. So we are very much hope that we can finally settle through dialogue with the U.S., but I'm not sure yet. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Vinh. Look, just a couple of points I'd make. A lot of the commentariat, when they saw the imposition of the tariffs on Liberation Day, were struck by the fact that the highest tariffs, almost the highest tariffs, with a couple of exceptions like Lesotho, for example, were on Southeast Asian countries for a number of reasons, and of course, including balance of trade. South America was pretty well totally in the 10% category. Southeast Asia was in the much higher category, 30 to 50%. It would appear, and this comment was made, I think frequently, that the economic side of Trump's house, or part of the economic side of Trump's house, that part that was dealing on the tariffs, didn't seem to be talking to the security strategic side of Trump's house, because the tariffs and the impact of the tariffs was on those countries which are really most contested for influence between the United States and China. And I just ask, your reflection on that and the impact on Southeast Asian attitudes towards the United States as a result of this tariff imposition, even though they can be negotiated still. We've got 90 days or more to negotiate that. What sort of impact has that had on countries like Vietnam, which have been actually very, very careful to tread a very, very cautious line between the United States and China? What sort of impact do you see this as having over the medium and longer term?
Actually, to us, as I observe the countries in the region and of ASEAN as well, we have been discussing on this issue, and things are still evolving, and we do not have seen a strategy developed by the Trump administration with regard to Indo-Pacific or to Southeast Asia. That is one point, and everybody think that why the U.S. is downgrading its relationship and focus on Europe, and it certainly will have to be back here in Asia and Indo-Pacific. That's one point that we are waiting to see a clearer picture of the U.S. policy. Point number two is that it seems that the U.S. is focusing more on China in its perspective of Indo-Pacific. So the China's focus policy will be different from the region's focus policy. If we highlight the focus of the U.S. as a strategic point with regard to Indo-Pacific, then every partners in the region, including ASEAN, will have a role to play. But if you look into look on the region through the perspective of China focus, then everything will be affected by that one. We do not see a clear defining of that strategy yet. So we are very much cautious of in observing how the U.S. will be playing out its strategy with regard to the region and with regard to China. Point number three, for ASEAN, certainly we would very much work to have the U.S. to continue its engagement in this region. The tariff will make a lot of challenge for ASEAN and ASEAN member countries, especially for those who are more oriented for exports. Certainly, there will be restructuring, but I'm not quite sure if after 90 days the U.S. will be in a position to continue all this high level of tariffs with regard to all countries, including those countries from Southeast Asia. That's one point. The second point is that we in the region, China has made a lot of influence economically here in the region in a number of ways. It has supply chains here in the region of Southeast Asia. It has, together with ASEAN countries, the FTAs like RCEP that just mentioned. And because of all this one, China's economic influence in the region has already been there. But there's another point is that in order for many countries in Southeast Asia to sustain its supply chain as current nature, it need to have both the Chinese market and the U.S. market. That is a problem because many of us export less to China, but export more to the U.S., import less from the U.S., but import more from China. I'm not quite sure if China is ready to observe more exports from Southeast Asia or not. There have been a number of suggestions for China to open its market in a way that it can receive support, exports from Southeast Asia, but I'm not quite sure if that can be the case. For now, both the U.S. and China continue to be very much important. China is the source, the U.S. is the destination, and in between we have ASEAN. Changing that scale of supply chains is not easy and not overnight. So I still see that the U.S. has a role to play, that things are evolving. We need to see a clearer picture of the U.S. with regard to Indo-Pacific and Southeast Asia. But what we must be preparing ourselves is that if changes are happen, we need to enhance regional integration, and certainly there will be a lot of difficulties ahead of us. Thank you.
Keith, do you have any perspectives on what Vinh just talked about, particularly from where you sit in Bangkok, albeit you're looking to this from an American perspective? You're also in a position to look at these issues from a Southeast Asian perspective.
Yeah, one thing I find interesting is there's a big within the U.S. I talk to the U.S. almost every day with friends and my Washington Post colleagues, et cetera. there's one big question hanging over everything in the US. And I think in Asia, they're answering that question differently. The question is what we're seeing now, is Trump 2.0, is that a passing phenomenon that's going to be gone soon? That next year you're going to have the midterm elections and the Democrats look like they're going to retake the House and maybe even the Senate now. Trump's poll numbers are down, and we'll be able to, if we can just survive the next 3 years and some months of Trump 2.0, things will go back to normal. Or does this represent a real change in America's policy going forward? And no matter who gets elected next time, they're going to continue this kind of high tariff, America first, protectionist, nationalist, isolationist policy. In America, people seem to be split. And particularly the people who don't like Trump or didn't vote for him are looking at his poll numbers collapsing. He's down in the polls on almost every issue, including the economy. And they're saying, okay, we can ride this out. This is a temporary phenomenon. In Asia, like Ambassador Vinh just said, and others, you seem to be kind of saying this is going to be the new normal going forward for the future. You can't plan on just burying your head in the sand and hoping this goes away. If I'm correct in interpreting what you're saying, Ambassador. I'm really kind of torn about that. I don't know what they think in Australia. Is this something, in Europe, they seem to be coming up with this idea that this is not something we can ride out. That the US is not going to come back in a few years, elect another Obama or another Biden, and things will go back to normal. They seem to think this is a real sea change.
Well, I mean, look, I think you hear the same debate in Australia amongst those people who follow these issues closely. I suspect there's also a sort of middle ground, and that is, you've got to remember that although Trump may in due course fade away, 45% of the American population, or 48%, whatever it was, did vote for him. And it reflects a particular perspective in the United States, which didn't exist to the same degree 15, 20 years ago. So in that sense, it's different. There is a political impulse there, which is manifested in a serious change. That doesn't mean to say, however, there mightn't be some quite considerable pullback, say after the midterms, or if a Democrat becomes president in 4 years' time. But I think the view that most of us have come to is the world has changed. It may not change as dramatically as we've thought in the first 3 months of the Trump administration, but it's not all going to be wound back. You're not going to get a wind back to Biden. And certain things are put in place which are very hard to change. Biden didn't change some of the trade policies that were put in place by Trump in Trump 1. So, it's a very good question, but certain things that Trump is going to do or is in process of doing, I'm afraid are there probably to stay. But I think it's very hard to see, for example, the American relationship with Europe going back to what it was 6 months ago. It's just so much has shifted. And of course, what happens in Ukraine is going to be pivotal. So that's enough from, my contribution, I think.
That's true. That's true. That's true.
Look, we've actually, I think, pretty well come to the end. This has been, very helpful to me to listen to the various perspectives. And I think the perspectives of Ambassador Vinh and Minister Mari Pangestu were actually very valuable to Australians who are trying to sort through what is happening. I mean, one thing I think that a lot of us are very convinced of, those who follow foreign policy closely, is that what happens in Southeast Asia as a reaction to the Trump administration, both because of the direct impact on Southeast Asia, but because of the impact of American policy on China, is going to be, crucial. And I think, American policymakers see the whole issue of how to deal with China as the most important of the three big policy areas that the Americans are currently dealing with. And the jury is going to be out for a while, but certainly from my perspective, this has been very helpful, I think, in trying to bring home to Australians some of the factors at play. So without more, I don't think I've got anything more to add, but would you, Vinh or Keith, would you like to add anything before we close up?
Just one point. Apart from countries in Southeast Asia, I think that everybody now is busy with dealing with Trump's tariffs. But major partners in the region like Australia, Korea, Japan, or even India, we need to think more of regional integration and cooperation, because we from ASEAN countries, we need not only China or the US, but at this point in time of challenges, we need Australia, we need Japan, and we need Korea very much. So we need to work all together as well. Thank you. That is a point also.
Look, I think that's a very good point, and you're already seeing closer discussions taking place between China, Korea, and Japan, of course. And I think that's something very, very mindful of. I think Mari also, particularly on the economic side, she didn't use this phrase today, but she has used this phrase in the past, a sort of coalition of the willing to try and address these economic issues in particular more cohesively than is perhaps currently taking place. Anyway.
Yeah.
So thank you both. Keith, anything more you'd like to add?
Just one quick point. I mean, someone asked the question in the chat there. I saw it's like, how much is Southeast Asia trying to balance between the superpowers? And I would just use the phrase I learned in Vietnam the other week, where you call it bamboo diplomacy, where the bamboo bends in whichever direction the wind is going, but it never quite breaks. And
it will be very much difficult these days, especially with regard to tariffs. What do you try?
The other quick point is, I mean, I think this is a really different, this very different, as Marie said, from Trump, as both of you said, from Trump 1.0. China is in a much stronger position than they were when Trump first came in office in 2017.
Sure.
And Xi Jinping rushed to Mar-a-Lago to make a deal. This time, China is not rushing to make a deal. They think they can ride this out, and they don't have to deal with the domestic pressure of an economic slowdown. The US has to deal with the domestic pressure, political pressure of an economic slowdown. So if it's a waiting game, I think the Chinese have the upper hand.
Good. Well, thank you both very much. Look, we very much appreciate your coming on this Asialink panel. Very much appreciate Mari pulling herself out of a meeting, because she's in the middle of negotiating on behalf of Indonesia with the United States. She's, as I understand it, the lead person in these issues. So thank you all very much indeed. Leah, thank you for the work you and your colleagues have done putting this panel together. And thank you also to Don Greenlees, who did a great deal of work behind the scenes on it. So thank you.
Thank you, John, and your team. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, John, for moderating the conversation tonight. And on behalf of Asialink, I'd also like to thank our excellent panel. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I hope to see you all at another Asialink webinar soon. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.